الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون. قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون. قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين. قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم. قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون. أأتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردن الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون. إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين. إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون. قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين. وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين. إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون. يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كما أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون. وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون. وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون. وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون. سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون. وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون. والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم. والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم. لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون. وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاع إلى حين. وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون. وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين. وإذا قيل لهم انفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أن نطعموا من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين. ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين. ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون. فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون. ونفخ في السور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون. قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون. إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون. فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتاز اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أحد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناهم من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقا قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد سورة المباركة الفاتحة بسم الله
محمد وآل محمد صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد 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 بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم إني أسألك برحمتك التي وسعت كل شيء وبقوتك التي قهرت بها كل شيء وهزأ لها كل شيء وذللها كل شيء وبجبروتك التي غلبت بها كل شيء وبعزتك التي لا يقوم لها شيء وبعظمتك التي ملأت كل شيء وبسلطانك الذي على كل شيء وبوجهك الباقي بعد فناء كل شيء وباسمائك التي ملأت أركان كل شيء وبعلمك الذي أحاط بكل شيء وبنور وجهك الذي أضاء له كل شيء يا نور يا قدوس يا أول الأولين ويا آخر الآخرين اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تختك الإثم اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل النقم اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تغير النعم اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تحبس الدعاء اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تقطع الرجاء اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل البلاء اللهم اغفر لي كل ذنب أذنبت وكل خطيئة أخطأتها اللهم إني أتقرب إليك بذكرك وتشفع بك إلي نفسك وأسألك بجودك أن تدنعني من قربك أن توزعني شكرك أن تلهمني ذكرك اللهم إني أسألك سؤال حازن متذلل هاش أن تسامحني وترحمني وتجعلني بكسمك راضيا قانئا وفي جميع أحوالي متوازيا اللهم وأسألك سؤال من اشتدت فاقته وأنزل بك عند شدائد حاجته وعزم فيما عندك رغبته اللهم عزم سلطانك ولا مكانك وخفي مكرك وظهر أمرك وغلب قهرك وجرت قدرتك ولا يمكن الفرار من حكومتك اللهم لا أجد لذنوبي غافرا ولا لكبائر ساترا ولا لشيء من عملي كبير بالحسن مبدلا خيرك لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك وبحمدك ظلمت نفسي وتجأرت بجهلي وسكنت إلى قديم ذكرك لي ومنك علي اللهم مولاي كم من كبير سترت وكم من فادي من بلاء وقلت وكم من إسار وكيت وكم من مكروه دفعت وكم من صناع جميل لست أهلا له نشرت اللهم أجمع بلاي وأفرت به سوء حالي وكسرت به أعمالي وقعتت به أعلالي وحبسني عن نفعي بعد عملي وحدثني دنيا بغرورها والنفس بجنايتها ومثالي يا سيدي فأسألك بعزتك أن يحجب عنك الدعاء سوء عملي وفعالي ولا تفزعني بحفي من طلعت عليه من سري ولا تعاجلني بعقوبتي على ما عملت في خلواتي من سوء فعلي وإساءتي ودوام تفريطي وجهالتي وكثرة شهواتي وغفلتي كن اللهم بعزتك لي في كل أحوالي رؤوفا وعلى في جميع أمور العطوفة إلهي وربي من لي غيرك أسألك كشف الزور والنظر في أمري إلهي ومولى أجريت على حكما اتبعت في هوى نفسي ولم أختلس فيه من تزيين عدوي فعرني بما أهوى وأشهد على ذلك القضاء فتجاوزك بما جرى علي من ذلك بعد حدودك وخلفت بعد أوامرك فلك الحمد على في جميع ذلك ولا حجة لي فيما جرى علي في قضاؤك وزمن حكمك وبلاؤك قد آتيتك يا إلهي بعد تقصيري وإسرافي على نفسي معتذرا نادما منكسرا مستقيلا مستغفرا منيبا مكرا مذعنا مغترفا لا أجد مفرا مما كان مني ولا مفزعا أتوجه إليه في أمري خير قبولك عذري ويدخلني إياي في ساعة رحمتك. اللهم فاقبل عذري وارحم شدة زري وفكني من شد وساكي. يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني ورقة جلدي ودقة عزمي. يا من بدأ خلقي وذكري وتربيتي وبري وتعزيني حبني لابتداء كرامك وسالف برك بي. يا إلهي وسيدي وربي أتراك معذبي بنارك بعد توحيدك وبعد من توى عليه قلبي من معرفتك وليجا به لسان من ذكرك واعتقده سميري من حبك وبعد صدق اقترافي ودعائي حازيا لربوبيتك. هيهات أنت أكرم من أن تسيح من ربيت أو تبعد من أزنيت أو تشرد من أويت أو تسلم إلى البلاء من كفيت ورحمت. وليت سئري يا سيدي وإلهي ومولى أتسلط النار على وجوه حرت لعظمتك ساجدا ولا ألسن نطقت بتوحيدك صادقة وبشكرك مادحة وعلى قلوب اقترفت بإلهيتك محققا وعلى سمائر تحوت من العلم بك حتى صارت خاشيا وعلى جوارها ساد إلى أوطان تعبدك طائئة وأشرت باستغفارك مذئنا. ما هكذا الظن بك ولا أخبرنا بفضلك عنك يا كريم. يا ربي وأنت تعلم ضعف عن قليل من بلاء الدنيا وعقوباتها وما يجري فيه من المكاره على أهلها على أن ذلك بلاء مكروه قليل مكسوه يسير بقاؤهم كثير مدة. فكيف احتمالي لبلاء الآخرة وجلي لوقوع المكاره فيها وهو بلاء تطول المدة ويدوم مقامه ولا يخفف عن أهله وإنه لا يكون إلا عن عذبك وانتقامك وساحتك وهذا ما لا تقوم له السماوات والأرض. لا يا سيدي فكيف إني أنا عبدك الضعيف الذليل حقير المسكين مستكين. يا إلهي وربي وسيدي ومولى لأي الأمور إليك أشكو لما منه أزج وأبكي لأليم الخيب وشدة أم لطول البلاء المدة. فلئن سيرتني لعقوباتي مع أعدائك وجمعت بيني وبين أهل البلاء وفارقت بيني وبين أحبائك وأوليائك فهبني يا إلهي وسيدي ومولى وربي. صبرت على عذابك فكيف أصبر على فراقك وهبني يا إلهي. صبرت على حر نارك فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك. أم كيف أسكن في نار ورجاء عفوك. فبعزتك يا سيدي ومولى أقسم صادقا لئن تركتني ناتك لأزيجن إليك بين أهلها زجيج العاملين ولأصفحن إليك صراخ المستصرخين ولا أبكين عليك بكاء الفاقدين ولا أنادينك أين كنت يا ولي المؤمنين. يا غاية أعمال العارفين لا غياث المستغيثين يا غياث المستغيثين يا غياث المستغيثين يا حبيب قلوب الصادقين يا إله العالمين أفتراك سبحانك يا إلهي وبحمدك تسمع فيها صوت عبد مسلم سجن فيها بمخالفته وذاك طعام عذاب بمعصيتي وحبس بين أطباقها بجرمك وجريرتي وهو يزج إليك زجيج المعمل لرحمتك ويناديك بلسان أهل توحيدك ويتوسل إليك بربوبيتك يا مولا فكيف يبقى في عذابي وهو يرجو ما سلف من حلمك أم كيف تؤلمه نار وهو يعمل فضلك ورحمتك أم كيف يغرقه لهيبها وأنت تسمع صوت نار مكانه أم كيف يشتمل عليه زفيرها وأنت تعلم ضعف أم كيف يتكلكل بين أطباقها وأنت تعلم صدق أم كيف تزجر صبانيتها وهو يناديك يا رب أم كيف يرجو فضلك في إتكه منها فتتركه فيها هيهات مع ذلك الظن بك ولا معروف من فضلك ولا مشبه لما عملت به موحدين من البر وإحسانك فباليقين أقطعه لولا ما حكمت به من تعذيب جاهديك وكسيت به من إهلاد معانديك لجعلت نارا كلها بردا وسلاما وما كانت لأحد فيها مكرا ولا مقاما لكنك تكسرت أسماؤك وأقسمت إلى تملها من الكافرين من الجنة والناس أجمعين وإن تخالد فيها المعاندين وأنت جل ثناؤك قلت مبتدئا وتتولد بالإنعام متكرما أفمن كان مؤمنا كمن كان فاسقا لا يستوون إلهي وسيدي فاسألك بقدرتي التي قدرتها وبكسية التي حتمتها وحكمتها وغلبت من عليه أجريتها أن تعب لي في هذه الليل وفي هذه الساعة كل جرم أجرمت وكل ذنب أذنبت وكل كذب أسررت وكل جهل عملت كتمته وأحلنت أخفيته وأظهرت وكل سيئة أمرت بإثباتها كرامة كاتبين الذين وكلته بحفظ ما يكون مني وجعلته شهودا على مع جواره وكنت أنت تقرب وكنت أنت ركيب علي من ورائهم والشاهد لما خفي عنكم وبرحمتك أخفيت وبفضلك سترت وأن توفر خزي من كل خير أنزلت أو إحسان فضلت أو بر نشرت أو رزق بسلت أو ذنب تغفر أو خطأ تستر يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا إلهي وسيدي ومولى ومالك ركي يا من بيده ناصيتي يا عليما بزري ومسكنتي يا خبيرا بفقري وفاقتي يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب أسألك بحقك وقدسك وعظم صفاتك وأسمائك أن تجعل أوقاتي من الليل والنهار بذكرك معمورة وبخدمتك الموصولة وأعمالي عندك مقبولة حتى تكون أعمالي وأورادي كلها وردا واحدا وحالي فيها خدمتك سرمدا يا سيدي يا من عليه معولي يا من إليه شكوت أهوالي يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا ربي قوي بي يا ربي يا رب قوي على خدمتك جواره واشدد على عزيمة جوانه وهب لي جد في خشيتك والدوام في اتصالي بخدمتك حتى أسهل إليك في ميادين سابق وأوصي إليك في بارزين واشتاق إلى قربك في المشتاقين وأدنو منك دنو المخلصين وخافك مهافة المؤمنين واجتمع في جوارها مع المؤمنين اللهم من أرادني بسوء فعارض ومن كادني فكيد واجعلني من أحسن عبيدك نصيبا عندك واقرب بهم منزلة منك وحسهم زلفة لديك فإنك لا ينال ذلك إلا بفضلك وجد لي بجودك وعطف علي بمجدك واحفظني برحمتك واجعل لساني بذكرك ليجا وقلبي بحبك متيما ومن علي بحسن إجابتك وكلني أسرتي واغفر لي زلتي فإنك قضيت على عبادك بعبادك وأمرتهم بدعائك وسمنت عليكم لهم الإجابة فإليك يا ربي نصبت وجهي وإليك يا ربي مددت يدي وبعزتك استجب لي دعائي وبلغني منايا ولا تقطع من فضلك رجائي واكفني شر الجن والإنس من أعدائي يا سريع الرضا يا سريع الرضا يا سريع الرضا اغفر لي لمن لا يملك إلا الدعاء فإنك فعال لما تشاء يا من اسمه الدعاء وذكره الشفاء وطاعته غنى ارحم من رأس مالك الرجاء وسلاح البكاء يا سابح النعم يا دافع النكم يا نور المستوحشين في الظلم يا عالما لا يعلم صل على محمد وآل محمد وافعل به ما أنت أهله وصلى الله على رسوله وأئمته الميامين من آله وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا سورة المباركة الفاتحة.
محمد وآل محمد صلوات. فاتحة. لختے جگر اگلتے ہیں شبر حسینیوں لختے جگر اگلتے ہیں شبر حسینیوں برپا ہے اہل بیت میں محشر حسینیوں لختے جگر اگلتے ہیں شبر حسینیوں کیا واقعہ غضب کا مدینے میں ہو گیا ہلتی ہے آج خبریں پیمبر حسینیوں قاسم یتیم ہوتا ہے بن بھائی کے حسین قاسم یتیم ہوتا ہے بن بھائی کے حسین کہتی ہے رو کے زینب مزتر حسینیوں روح بطول خاک اڑاتی ہے لاش پر سر پیٹتے ہیں فاتح خیبر حسینیوں تابوت پر حسن کے چڑھاتے ہیں اشقیاء پھولوں کے بدلے تیروں کی چادر حسینیوں پھولوں کے بدلے تیروں کی چادر حسینیوں لختے جگر اگلتے ہیں شبر حسینیوں درود بر محمد و آل محمد فاتحہ جس دم حسن کا زہر سے ٹکڑے جگر ہوا سپارہ دل کا آہوں سے زیر و زبر ہوا سمکا جو روح پاک پر ظاہر اثر ہوا حال امام پاک کا اس دم دیگر ہوا حال امام پاک کا اس دم دیگر ہوا راحت نے فرخ اور شکم میں خلل پڑا کٹ کر کلیجہ تشت کے اندر نکل پڑا، کٹ کر کلیجہ تشت کے اندر نکل پڑا، بستر پہ درد دل سے تڑپنے لگے امام، صدمے سے سبز ہونے لگا روح فرق عام، چلائے ہاتھ سے یہ کلیجے کو تھام تھام، دوڑو بہن کے کام ہمارا ہوا تمام، دوڑو بہن کے کام ہمارا ہوا تمام، یہ کہتے کہتے زرد رخ پاک ہو گیا، چلاتے تھے کہ ہائے جگر چاک ہو گیا، چلاتے تھے کہ ہائے جگر چاک ہو گیا، فرماتے تھے حسن کے بلاؤ حسین کو، تھا دم بدم یہ حکم کے لاؤ حسین کو، بھائی کا حال زار سناؤ حسین کو، ٹکڑے میرے جگر کے دکھاؤ حسین کو، ٹکڑے میرے جگر کے دکھاؤ حسین کو، کہہ دو کہ جلد آئیے رحلت کا وقت ہے، سن جائیے کچھ آ کے وصیت کا وقت ہے، سن جائیے کچھ آ کے وصیت کا وقت ہے، آئے حسین اتنے میں بچشم اشک بار، چلاتے تھے کہ آپ کی غربت کے میں نثار، شبر گلے کو چوم کے کہتے تھے بار بار، میں تم پہ صدقے ہے میرے نانا کے یادگار، مجھ سے زیادہ ظلم و ستم تم پہ ہوئیں گے، ہم خبر میں تمہاری مصیبت پہ روئیں گے، ہم خبر میں تمہاری مصیبت پہ روئیں گے، جس دم حسن کا زہر سے، صلوات علی محمد و آل محمد۔
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الخلق أجمعين، سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وجعلناهم أئمة يهدون بأمرنا وأوحينا إليهم فعل الخيرات وإقام الصلاة وإيتاء الزكاة وكانوا لنا عابدين. God states in the Holy Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and we appointed them as leaders to guide by our command. And we revealed to them the doing of good deeds and the observance of prayer and the giving of alms, and they worshipped us alone. Amanna billah. Sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. Let us begin once again by enlivening our hearts and minds and our gathering with the remembrance of the Holy Prophet and his purified progeny. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali. We live in a consumer society. A society that conditions us and encourages us from a very young age to constantly acquire various goods and services in an ever-increasing manner. That we always look to acquire things and services to train us, to condition us to gather and to collect and to take. And we often find that throughout our daily lives, we are bombarded with advertisements. Everywhere we look, there are advertisements that are trying to reel us in, to encourage us, to entice us into pursuing and to acquiring goods and services. I remember reading once that the average person on a daily basis experiences or sees anywhere between 4,000 to 10,000 advertisements per day. Now this sounds like a very big number, but if you think about it, especially in our day and age of social media, I mean, if you open any of the social media sites or apps, every other post that you scroll through in your feed is basically an advertisement, right? When, kids are playing games on their tablets, there's always advertisements. Videos that we watch on YouTube and other streaming services always have advertisements, right? It's all around us. Billboards we see, not so much now, less so now, but, magazines, the news, TV, it's all around us. So we are bombarded with advertisements that are always encouraging us to acquire goods and services. And, someone humorously remarked one time that the reason why every American household does not own an elephant is because no one has yet offered to provide or sell elephants for $0 down and small monthly payments. Right? If that existed, we would probably all own elephants. And not only are we conditioned to always acquire goods and services, but also we are conditioned and encouraged to outdo one another in our acquiring of goods and services. We kind of keeping up with the Joneses, right? We look at our friends, families, our colleagues, our neighbors, and if they have something, we kind of want something that is bigger and greater, right? If one of my colleagues gets a promotion, I want a better promotion. If they have a particular job, I want a job that is better, that has a better salary. If they have a particular home, I get a better home and a better car, and so on and so forth. That we outdo one another, right? So we're conditioned. In a word, we are conditioned to be takers, to always take, and to take more and more. Now, when we examine the lives of those who are righteous, those great people who came before us, the prophets, the messengers, the Ahlul Bayt, other righteous individuals throughout the history of humankind, we find often that one of the hallmarks of their personalities and their attributes, the ways that they lived their lives, was that not only were they takers, they consumed, but they were also givers. They gave. They were well aware and mindful of others and their needs, their explicit needs, their apparent needs, and their implicit and not so apparent needs. The Holy Quran tells us in chapter 21, Surah Al-Anbiya, verse 73, which I began with, God says, وَجَعَلْنَاهُمْ أَئِمَّةً يَهْدُونَ بِأَمْرِنَا. And we made them, or we appointed them, a'imma, which are leaders, guides, who guide by God's command. يَهْدُونَ بِأَمْرِنَا. And then God says, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْهِمْ فِعْلَ الْخَيْرَاتِ. And we revealed to them, God revealed to them, the doing of good. This is before what? Before iqam as-salat, the establishment of prayers and other acts of worship. God says, and we revealed to them the doing of good. We find in the Quran other examples where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the righteous and the good. He says in verse 9 of chapter 59, وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. And they put the needs of others before themselves, despite being in need themselves. The Mufassirun, the exegetes, when they come to the interpretation of this verse, verse 9 from chapter 59, they tell us that the reason why this verse was revealed, what is known as technically as sababun nuzul, the reason why this verse was revealed in the Quran, was that one day a needy man comes into the mosque of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Medina, and he asked those who were in attendance, he asked them for assistance. He was needy. And the Holy Prophet, he looks around, his companions, those who are around him, and he asks them simply, who will take care of this person? The Prophet, he himself never said no to anyone. The traditions tell us that the Prophet would stay hungry for up to 3 days because he would give others. So much so that the famous hadith tells us that he would tie a rock around his stomach in order to decrease the pain of hunger. Right? So the Prophet would give. But sometimes the Prophet tried to encourage others around him as well. He would look for opportunities in order to encourage those, his followers, his companions, those around him, to also do good, to contribute. And so he asks those in attendance, who will take care of this man? One man stands up and he says, I'll take care of him, Ya Rasulullah. So he takes him along, takes him to his home there, and he hosts him for the night in his home. He approaches his wife and he asks her, he says, do we have anything to give? We have a guest tonight. Do we have any food to give? And she tells him, we only have a very small amount. That's enough for, our very small family, us and our children. So he instructs her, he says, feed the children and give me the rest of the food. And so she does. She gives him the rest of the food, and it's only enough really for one person. So he brings the food and he places it in front of his guest. And the tradition says that he did not want the guest to feel uncomfortable. So he dimmed the number of candles that were there so that the guest could eat comfortably. The man stayed there. The following day, he brought him back to the mosque of the Prophet. When the Prophet saw them, he smiled. He had a big smile. And Jibreel alayhi salam, he came down. And he revealed the following verse. وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. And they put the needs of others before their own needs, despite being in need themselves. And the Mufassirun, they tell us that the family that hosted this needy man was none other than the family of Amir al-Mu'mineen and the Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. They were in need. They had a humble amount of food. Yet despite this need, their own need, they put the needs of others before their own needs. And this is how the Quran describes to us these great personalities. That a hallmark of their personalities and their traits was that they were givers. And when we come to the life of our second Imam, Al-Imam Al-Hasan Al-Mujtaba alayhi salam, we find that he was a man, of course, of many virtues, but one of the leading virtues that stands out, if you read the legacy of Al-Imam Al-Hasan, about his life, you find that one of the leading attributes was his altruism. What is altruism? Altruism is when you put others before yourself. When you are selfless. The opposite of being what? Selfish. Putting yourself before others. Right? That Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam, he was selfless. And this trait of being selfless and altruistic, it's not something that happens overnight. It's not something that someone is inspired with. Suddenly they wake up and they feel selfless and they want to put the needs of others. This is something, like many of the virtues, which is what? Which is developed. And so it's no surprise because Imam Hasan grows up in this household. He grows up in that family of kindness and generosity. That family that never said no. It's no surprise because the tradition tells us, Al-Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam, he describes his mother, Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam. The very famous tradition, you've all heard it. He says, when I was a young child, I used to often observe my mother engaged in worship. This is very beautiful. Very beautiful way for Sayyidah Fatima to teach her children is for them to be able to observe and to see. Very beautiful. You know, you see a child, no matter how many times you tell them something, you all know this as parents, it's not as effective as them actually seeing it being done. You can tell the child, get up, it's the time of prayer, get up and pray. But it's much more effective for them to see that at the time of prayer, you let everything go, you put everything aside, and you actually get up to pray. It's much more effective. So he would observe his mother. He says, I observed my mother during her worship, during her prayers. And after she completed her prayers, she raised her hands in dua. And she began to pray. She turned to God. And he says, I heard her praying for everyone. All of the people that we knew. The companions of the Prophet, his followers, those who were devoted to him, family members, extended family members. Banu Hashim was a very large family. Extended family members. And she continued praying and mentioning the names of everyone. And then all the way at the end of her dua, she mentioned our names. And so he says, I asked her, I said, dear mother, why is it that you always keep our names all the way to the end of the dua? We're the closest to you. Why don't you mention us first? And he says, she replied to me with very powerful words. She said, Bunay, my son, al-jar thumma ad-dar, your neighbor before yourself. Your neighbor before yourself. Even when we pray. In fact, the ahadith, they tell us one way to guarantee acceptance of our prayers is if you pray for others before you pray for yourself. Even in our prayers, that we don't forget others, that we remember there are others and that we pray for them. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help them, to assist them, to provide for them. And this is the same household that Surah Ad-Dahr tells us very clearly, right? وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا. That very famous incident where the family, the entire family, is fasting for 3 days as a vow for the illness that Imam Hasan, Imam Hussein had. And they see this, these children, they see this with their own eyes. They see their father and mother gather the food that they have and give it 3 nights consecutively to those who are in need. Even though they were fasting, they were hungry. They spent the entire day fasting, but they gave it away. They saw this. So it's no surprise that these children, who would then become the Imams, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein alayhim as-salam, and the rest, as Sayyidah Zainab and Kulthum, that they would grow up with this value of altruism and selflessness. And this is a very important lesson for us when it comes to teaching others. That we incorporate these values and we embody these values in our own lives. And so when we examine the life of Imam al-Hasan, we find numerous examples, very beautiful examples of this selflessness, of the Imam being altruistic, being mindful of the needs of others. In one very beautiful example, we're told that one day Imam al-Hasan, he comes across a group of young people who were poor. They were not well off, were very meager in terms of their provisions. And they were sitting together and they're sharing a very humble meal amongst themselves. When they notice that the Imam is passing by them, they call him and they invite him. They tell him, Yabna Rasulillah, O grandson of the Prophet, please join us. Please sit with us. And Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, he doesn't say no. He could have made any excuse. I have a meeting, I'm running late, I'm invited for lunch, whatever it may be. But he does not say no, he does not refuse them. He goes and he sits with them and he shares in this humble meal. After he finishes, he invites them over. He tells them, come with me. He takes them back to his own home. And there, he had some of his followers and companions. You can imagine in the home of, the Ahlul Bayt, they would have internally where, domestic, where their family is located. And then there's an outdoor area where their companions would come and they would spend time with them and so on. So some of the companions are basically hanging around in the home of the Imam. And so the Imam brings these young men in and he orders that they are given food, they are fed, and that they are given money and whatever they need. And so one of those who are sitting, he witnesses this entire event, that the Imam was sitting with these young men, the Imam brought them back home and he gave them, and so he asked him, he told him, Yabna Rasulillah, this was a very kind gesture of yours, to feed them, to give them, clothing and to give them money and provisions and everything that they need. But I'm confused about something. Is what you did kind of equal to what they did? Right? In other words, they just offered a very humble meal to you, but in return you gave them so much. Listen to the answer of Imam Hasan. He says, what they did was greater than what I did. Because I gave them some of what I have, they gave me everything they had. They gave me everything they had. They were ready to share everything that they had. And so their act is greater than mine. It's not about just numbers, right? It's not just about quantity. We know it is about quality. This quality of generosity and kindness and selflessness and being mindful to others. In another beautiful event, Imam Hasan alayhi salam, he's sitting in his home and he has guests over. And the Imam chooses to sit on, the tradition says, a tattered sack. It's old, just something very humble. He sits on there, whereas his guests, he placed for them comfortable cushions. And again, one of his companions, he says, Yabna Rasulillah, why don't you sit on one of these? I mean, you have them. It's not like you don't own them. You have them. Why don't you sit on them? And he replies, he says that I like to see my guests be comfortable. I want them to be comfortable. It's very beautiful, huh? This idea of putting the needs of others, putting the comfort of others before our own comfort, being selfless. It's very, very beautiful. The traditions tell us that time and time again, the Imam, he often would give half of his wealth away. Sometimes, the hadith says 2 or 3 times throughout his life, he even gave his entire wealth away. Everything that he had, he would give. Again, this act of kindness and generosity that he would often, very frequently, he would host people in his home and he would feed people. He would give them. And one day he was asked, Yabna Rasulillah, why is it that you never refuse people? Why is it that you never say no to people? This was the beautiful trait of the family of the Prophet. They never said no. Al-Farazdaq, who was a very well-known poet, who lived during the time of the 4th Imam, Al-Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, very well-known. He describes the 4th Imam in very beautiful poetry. Part of it, he says, ما قال لا قط إلا في تشهده لولا التشهد كانت لاؤه نعم. He's describing the 4th Imam. He says, he never said no in his life except, there was only one exception. He never said no. La is no in Arabic. He never said no except with one exception. What is that one exception? When he would say, La ilaha illallah. That's the only time. This is what Al-Farazdaq is saying. That's the only time he would ever say no. And then he says, لَوْلَا التَّشَهُّدُ كَانَتْ لَاؤُهُ نَعَمُ. Had it not been for that testimony, the need to negate and say no in the testimony, every one of his no's would have been a yes. He would have always said yes. This was the family of the Prophet. So he is asked, Imam Hasan is asked, why do you never refuse? You never refuse. And he answered very simply, but in a very powerful way. Something for us to think about. He said, because I don't want God to ever refuse me. I don't want God to refuse me. How can it be that I expect God to always answer me and say yes to me, but that I would refuse someone who is in need? We want God to provide for us. We want God to be merciful to us, to be compassionate to us. We want God to forgive us, to overlook our faults. These are divine traits. These are divine attributes. These are attributes that we can incorporate in our lives. Right? And Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, and this is the this is the framework of his kindness and his generosity, is that he had empathy. What is empathy? Empathy is when you are able to put yourself in the place of others. Put yourself in the other's shoes, essentially. Empathy is one of the strongest values that we can adopt in our lives. It really makes the world a much better place. It helps with tolerating people, understanding people, feeling their plight and their pain. It really makes the world a much better place if we're all able to establish and develop empathy in our lives. And Imam Hasan alayhi salam had this sense of empathy. So much so that even those who turned against him, in the famous tradition, the man comes from Syria. Syria at the time of Imam al-Hasan was dominated by whom? By the Umayyads, by Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan. And we all know that the Umayyads, they were very skillful in their propaganda against the Ahlul Bayt, and especially against Amir al-Mu'mineen and his descendants, right? So this man comes from this region, and he's been fed all sorts of poison regarding the family of the Prophet and the descendants of Amir al-Mu'mineen. So he comes and he narrates this tradition. He says, I came to the city of Medina. And when I arrived, I said, point me to Al-Hasan ibn Ali. Show me where he is. I want to meet him. So he was pointed in the direction of Imam al-Hasan. He says, I approached him, I asked him, I said, are you Al-Hasan ibn Ali? He said, yes, I am Al-Hasan ibn Ali. He says, as soon as he confirmed his identity, he says, I started to spew all sorts of hateful language. Everything. I cursed him, I cursed his father, I cursed his mother, I cursed his family. I said everything that I could. He then says, once I was done, the Imam looked at me and he smiled. And then he asked me, he said, it seems like you are a stranger, you're not from Medina. It seems like you've come from elsewhere. Very beautiful way. That you've come from somewhere else. And if that's the case, if you're a traveler here, you're a stranger, if you need a place to stay, we can give you a place to stay. If you need food, we can give you food. If you need money, we can give you money. If you need provisions to continue on to your journey, we can give you provisions. Whatever it is that you need, we'll try to provide for you. He says, when I heard this, he says, I was so ashamed. I was so embarrassed. I just wanted the earth to open up and just swallow me whole. He says, I turned to him and I began to apologize. I said, Yabna Rasulillah, O grandson of the Messenger of God, please forgive me. This family, your family, is not that family that has been described to us. We've been told a different story. And I realized that this is not true. You are the family of kindness and goodness and mercy and compassion. So please forgive me and allow me to be at your service. And he says the Imam was so graceful towards me. And after that, he continued as one of the close companions of the Imam. The Imam here displays for us the essence of empathy. It's easy to quickly judge and give someone, not to give someone the benefit of the doubt and become upset. And this person is cursing me. They've disgraced me, they've dishonored me, and I say the same back to them, and I retaliate in the same manner. It's very easy, and oftentimes that's the first reaction we have, right? If you're driving on the road and someone cuts you off, you're probably going to want to do the same or more, right? If someone says something harmful, you're probably going to be upset very quickly. And Imam al-Hasan teaches us what empathy is. This person is a stranger. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. They're probably hungry, they're tired from a long journey, they need provisions, they need a place to stay. And it's through this empathy and through this kindness of spirit and generosity that the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, they were able to draw people to them and to draw people to the truth of the prophetic teachings and the prophetic lifestyle and those values that the Quran teaches and that the Prophet teaches and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, they teach. And so, as the followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, we come together, we commemorate, we remember Imam Hasan. It's good for us to think about it, to spend some time tonight, inshallah, and think about how can we also, in a similar fashion, also like the Ahlul Bayt, like Imam Hasan, also be givers in a greater capacity. What can we do? How can we live our lives in a way in which we're not just concerned about our own needs and our own fulfillments, but also that we are mindful of others around us. Also that we are selfless, that we put the needs of others before our own needs. And here, the beautiful thing about our tradition is that it always focuses on the quality of our actions, not just the quantity. We don't have to do too much. Doesn't always have to be big or make headlines. Even those things that we consider to be small, in the eyes of God, they can be magnificent. The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, Allahumma salli alayhi. He says, لا تحقرن شيئا من المعروف. Never underestimate or undervalue any opportunity for good. This is what the Prophet says. ولو أن تلقى أخاك ووجهك مبسوط إليه. Even if it means that you receive your brother with a smile. Even if it just means that you smile. That's all. You just smile, right? Even if it means, the other ahadith, they tell us, they give us some examples of doing goodness and kindness to others. The hadith says one example of this is guiding someone who's blind. Gives us an example. You're just providing direction. You're providing guidance to someone, right? Or the hadith gives the example of removing an obstacle from the road. Could be something small, right? Back then, there was no 7 or 8 lane freeways. The path was a small path, so any small object could be an obstacle on the road. For you to remove, you come across an obstacle and you remove this obstacle so that you clear the path for others. These are small acts, right? The hadith gives us as examples so as to inspire us not just to think of quantity but quality. That we develop this sense, it becomes second nature in our lives. That we develop this sense of selflessness, being mindful to others. In, of course, the famous hadith of the Prophet when he speaks about the month of Ramadan and the blessings of the month of Ramadan, the bounties of the month of Ramadan, in the end of the sermon, he says, اتقوا النار ولو بشق تمرة اتقوا النار ولو بشربة من الماء. He says, seek salvation even by offering to someone who is fasting at the time of iftar, even by offering a part of a date, بشق تمرة. Not a full date, just a portion of a date. اتقوا النار ولو بشربة من الماء. By offering someone a sip of water. Doesn't even have to be a full cup of water, just a sip of water. Right? Here again emphasizing that it's about this quality of generosity, of being mindful to others. And Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he says, nothing is greater than kindness except the reward of kindness. It's very beautiful. Nothing is greater than kindness except its reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are some of the things that we learn from thinking about and reflecting on the lives of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, and in particular on the life of Imam Hasan. Imam Hasan lived his life with various challenges and trials. he had to deal with two major fronts. One was an external front, embodied by Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan and Bani Umayyah. And the challenges that came with that. Bani Umayyah, we know, spent decades cursing Ali ibn Abi Talib and his descendants off the pulpits. Can you imagine? You go to Friday prayer, the Muslims are all gathered, and the khatib, the speaker, ends his sermon by cursing those who were closest to the holy prophets. On the one hand, the mu'adhin says, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. On the other hand, the khatib curses the descendants of the Prophet. And this happens for 60, 70 years. Can you imagine what this did to generations of people? That kind of propaganda? This is what Imam Hasan had to deal with in its early stages. So he had this front of Muawiyah and Bani Umayyah, but also he had another front, which was the domestic or internal front. And that is that those who should have been the most loyal to the Imam, some of them turned against the Imam. Because of the circumstances, we know, of course, that Imam Hasan alayhi salam, he held a peace treaty with Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan. Thousands were killed, thousands of Muslims. Because of Muawiyah and because of others who waged war against Amir al-Mu'mineen and his followers, thousands were killed, so much blood was spilled. And Imam al-Hasan found it suitable to put together a peace treaty to stop the bloodshed with Muawiyah. And many were unhappy with this decision, amongst even his followers. And they made this very clear. The traditions, they tell us that some of his followers, they expressed their disapproval in some very harsh terms. Some, they would see the Imam and they would greet him with the following phrase. They would say, Assalamu alayka ya mudhill al-mu'mineen. Peace be upon you, O humiliator of the believers. This is how they would greet their Imam. And these were supposed to be his followers and his companions. And of course, we know that Muawiyah, he arranged with one of the closest people to the Imam himself, his own wife, Ju'da, that she would poison him and put an end to his life. And what did he tell her? Muawiyah tells her, Ju'da, if you take care of the Imam, if you poison him, if you kill him, then your reward for this act will be what? That I will give you in marriage to my son Yazid. What a beautiful gift. What a beautiful reward. Huh? If you do this, I'll let you marry my son Yazid. And the tradition says that Ju'da, she was deceived. She was deceived by the beauties, the false promises of this life. And so indeed, she did poison Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. And in fact, the tradition tells us that after she committed this heinous act, she went to Muawiyah. She said, I've done my part. Now it's time for me to collect my reward. Muawiyah, he was cunning. He tells her, Ju'da, how do you expect me to give you in marriage to my son when you are ready to poison your husband? You're ready to kill him. Now you want me to give my son to you in marriage? Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam is poisoned. And he becomes weak. The poison enters into his body. And the traditions describe for us the agony and the anguish that he faced, the pain that he faced. Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, she comes to visit her brother Imam al-Hasan, that very difficult state. She enters and she sees her brother. He's regurgitating blood. Imagine how difficult this would be for Sayyidah Zainab to see. Her eldest brother, her love, for her to see him in this state. It's painful for her. It's very difficult for her. But I don't know which was more difficult for Sayyidah Zainab. The sight of her brother Al-Hasan in this state, or the sight of her brother Hussein in his state. Imam Hussein comes to visit his older brother. He says, Ya Aba Muhammad, my dear brother, seeing you in this state pains my heart. I can't stand seeing you like this. You're in pain, in this miserable state. And Imam al-Hasan, he looks up at his brother, his younger brother, Aba Abdullah. He tells him, my dear brother, La yawm ka yawmika ya Aba Abdullah. Yes, this is a difficult day, but there is no day like your day, Aba Abdullah. That day when Hussein stands all by himself, he's standing facing an enormous army. He turns left and right and he says, Ala hal min nasirin yansuruna. Is there no one to come to our rescue? Is there no one to come to our aid? His brothers, his sons, his cousins, his family members, his companions have all been slain. They are lying on the battlefield. And he stands before the enemy army all alone, without support and without help. When Al-Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam, he died, his family, they came around him, they washed him, they shrouded him. They put him in the coffin in order to be buried alongside his grandfather, the Holy Prophet. Even then, after his death, he was oppressed. He was not allowed to be buried by that who was closest to him. That person who was closest to him, his grandfather Rasulullah. They did not allow him. But still, Al-Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam, he was buried. Whereas his brother Abu Abdullah, for 3 days, he was left without being washed or shrouded or buried. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the sake of Al-Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam, and for the sake of his grandfather Rasulullah and his grandmother Sayyidah Khadija and his father Amir al-Mu'mineen and his mother Fatima al-Zahra and his brother Aba Abdullah and his sisters Sayyidah Zainab and Sayyidah Kulthum. We ask Allah to forgive our sins, our shortcomings, to inspire in our hearts and minds that we live our lives as the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam taught us and inspired us to live our lives. We ask Allah to honor us with the ziyarah of Muhammad wa al-Muhammad in this life and their shafa'ah and intercession in the hereafter. We ask Allah the Almighty to honor us by witnessing the reappearance of our 12th Imam, Al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan al-Mahdi, ajalallahu ta'ala farajahu al-sharif. We ask Allah to bring relief and comfort to those who are sick, those who are ill, those who are in need, those who are facing oppression and injustice and poverty around the world. We ask Allah to bring them relief and comfort and to hasten the reappearance of our 12th Imam, and finally to send blessings and peace upon the souls of all of the marhumin. For all of their souls, let us recite Surah Al-Fatiha ma'a salat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. يا حسين.
جودہ ملعون نے زہر حلال دیا، زہر سے مارا گیا، آتا جنازہ ہے، مروان ملعون نے تیروں کی بارش کیا، تیروں سے چھیلا گیا، آتا جنازہ ہے، فوج ملک ساتھ ہے، سر کھلے جبریل ہے، شور یہی ہے بپا، آتا جنازہ ہے، ماتم حسین یا حسین
یا حسن یا حسن یا حسن یا حسن، پیغام برس رہے ہیں تابوت پر حسن کے، پیغام برس رہے ہیں تابوت پر حسن کے، پیغام برس رہے ہیں تابوت پر حسن کے، امت مٹا رہی ہے آثار پنجتن کے، پیغام برس رہے ہیں تابوت پر حسن کے، زینب پکاری بھائی دل ڈوبتا ہے میرا، زینب پکاری بھائی دل ڈوبتا ہے میرا، اگلو نہ دل کے ٹکڑے صدقے گئی دہن کے، اگلو نہ دل کے ٹکڑے صدقے گئی دہن کے، پیغام برس رہے ہیں تابوت پر حسن کے، زینب ہے بھول کھولے امت ہے تیر تولے، زینب ہے بال کھولے امت ہے تیر تولے، پوچھو نہ شام کی جب یہ ہاں ہے وطن کے پوچھو نہ شام کی جب یہ حال ہے وطن کے بابا کے دل کے ٹکڑے تو نے گنے 72 بابا کے دل کے ٹکڑے تو نے گنے 72 ٹکڑے 1000 ہوں گے قاسم میرے بدن کے ٹکڑے 1000 ہوں گے قاسم تیرے بدن کے تابوت سے لپٹ کر قاسم پکارے بابا تابوت سے لپٹ کر قاسم پکارے بابا نوحہ اخی کا دیکھو دکھڑ ہے بہن کے نوحہ اخی کے دیکھو دکھڑ سنو بہن کے یثرب میں کربلا میں بغداد سامرا میں یثرب میں کربلا میں بغداد سامرا میں افسوس پھول بکھرے افسوس پھول بکھرے زہرا تیرے چمن کے پیغام برس رہے ہیں تابوت پر حسن کے یا حسین حسین یا 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 حسین 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 اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد.
Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. I want to thank you, Sayyid Hadi, for gracing us with your presence and your enlightening lecture. May Allah, inshallah, continue to increase our iman. Our next program, inshallah, will be Saturday, August 26th at 6 o'clock. We will be commemorating the Wafat of Bibi Sakina and the 30th of Imam Hussein. And then on Sunday, August 27th at 3 o'clock, there will be a majlis organized by the family of Marhum Ghulam Ali and Marhuma Zahra Banu Fazal, commemorating the shahadat of Sayyida Sakina alayhi salam. Please recite Surah Fatiha for Marhum Ghulam Ali Qasim Somji and family, and Kul Mu'mineen and Mu'minat. Surah Mubarak al-Fatiha. Ziyarat. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليك يا وارث آدم صفوة الله السلام عليك يا وارث نوح النبي الله السلام عليك يا وارث إبراهيم خليل الله السلام عليك يا وارث موسى كليم الله السلام عليك يا وارث عيسى روح الله السلام عليك يا وارث محمد حبيب الله السلام عليك يا وارث علي الأمير المؤمنين عليه السلام السلام عليك يا ابن محمد المصطفى السلام عليك يا ابن علي المرتضى السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة الزهراء السلام عليك يا ابن خديجة الكبرى السلام عليك يا ثار الله وابن ثاري والوتر الموتور أشهد أنك قد أقمت الصلاة وآتيت الزكاة وأمرت بالمعروف ونهيت عن المنكر وأطعت الله ورسوله حتى أتاك اليقين فلعن الله أمة قتلتك ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك ولعن الله أمة سمعت بذلك فرضيت به يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله أشهد أنك كنت نورا في الأصلاب الشامخة والأرحام المطهرة لم تنجسك الجاهلية بأنجاسها ولم تلبسك من مهمات بثيابها. وأشهد أنك من دعائم الدين وأركان المؤمنين. وأشهد أنك الإمام البر التقي الرضي الزكي الهادي المهدي. وأشهد أن الأئمة الولدك كلمة التقوى وعلام الهدى والعروة الوثقى والحجة على أهل الدنيا. وأشهد الله ملائكته وأنبياءه ورسلا أني بكم مؤمن وبيا بكم موقن بشرائع ديني وخواتيم عملي وقلبي لقلبكم سلم وأمري لأمركم متبع. صلوات الله عليكم وعلى أرواحكم وعلى أجسادكم وعلى أجسامكم وعلى شاهدكم وعلى غائبكم وعلى ظاهركم وعلى باطنكم. السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله. السلام عليك يا ابن نبي الله. السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا ابن الحسين الشهيد. السلام عليك أيها الشهيد. السلام عليك أيها المظلوم وابن المظلوم. لعن الله أمة قتلتك ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك ولعن الله أمة سمعت بذلك فرضيت به. السلام عليك يا أولياء الله وأحباء. السلام عليكم يا أسفياء الله وأوداء. السلام عليكم يا أنصار دين الله. السلام عليكم يا أنصار رسول الله. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليكم يا أنصار فاطمة سيدة النساء العالمين. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أبي محمد حسن بن علي ولي الناصح. السلام عليكم يا أنصار أبي عبد الله بأبي أنتم وأمي طبتم وطابت الأرض التي فيها دفنتم وفزتم فوزا عظيما. فيا ليت لي كنتم معكم فأفوز معكم. السلام عليك يا أبا الفضل العباس ابن أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا ابن سيد الوسيين. السلام عليك يا ابن أول القوم الإسلام وأقدمهم إيمانا وأقومهم بدين الله وأحوتهم على الإسلام. أشهد لقد نصحت لله ولرسوله ولأخيك فنعم الأخ المواسي. فلعن الله أمة قتلتك ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك ولعن الله أمة استحلت منك المحارم وانتهكت حرمة الإسلام. فنعم الأخ السابر المجاهد المحامي الناصر والأخ الدافع عن أخيه المجيب إلى طاعة ربي الراغب فيما زهد فيه غيره من الثواب الجزيل والثناء الجميل. والحقق الله بدرجة آبائك في جنات النعيم. السلام عليك يا رسول الله. السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء. السلام عليك يا علي المرتضى. السلام عليك يا خديجة الكبرى. السلام عليك حسن المجتبى. السلام عليك يا حسين الشهيد وابن الشهيد. السلام عليك يا علي زين العابدين. السلام عليك يا محمد باقر. السلام عليك يا جعفر الصادق. السلام عليك يا موسى الكاظم. السلام عليك يا علي الرضا. السلام عليك يا محمد تقي. السلام عليك يا علي النقي. السلام عليك يا حسن أسكري ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليك يا صاحب العرش والزمان. الأمان الأمان الأمان. السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن. السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان. السلام عليك يا إمامنا وإمام الإنس والجان. عجل الله لك ما وعدك من الناس وظهور الأمر ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقاعدا وناصرا وذليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرزك توعا وتمتيه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم صل